Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're talking about the Spinwards Frontier, by which I mean all the territory between the Republic's Spinward sectors on one end and the Rakatan remnant on the other, but which isn't in Chiss space. The Chiss get their own video. Unlike the territory of the Republic, the unknown regions aren't divided into sectors, so I kinda have to freestyle the borders here. The Spinwards Frontier is a region I made up to match the structure of my usual sector-based videos. Also, although we're dealing with parts of the unknown regions that are on the borders with freestanding subsectors, so there's lots of known planets with long histories with the Republic, none of this region is fully explored. Don't be surprised if there's an entire alien civilization out there that we just don't know about because we didn't check the right planet until last week. See, the way space is explored, exploration vessels plot short hyperspace routes from one star to the next and either send probe droids or else personally go down to check which planets have a breathable atmosphere. Now, for every one inhabited planet in the galaxy, there are, no joke, about 100,000 star systems with no inhabited planets. That does include places like Dagobah that have a breathable atmosphere but no one actually living on them. Mostly that is the hundreds of billions with a B planets that have no breathable atmosphere in the first place. They don't show up on maps because no one cares about a planet you can't breathe on when there's so many you can to go around. But if you want to pick out a lifeless rock to suffocate on, you really are spoiled for choice, even in the core. So when explorers are trying to go as far into unknown space as possible, they can get like 5,000 light years in by following a spaghetti trail of planets 4 or 5 light years away from each other. But if you want to find all the decently usable planets and make a new sector out of them, you have to visit tens of millions of solar systems looking for the good planets. You can do 3 or 4 star systems a day usually, and it's pretty obvious from orbit whether or not there's any life on a planet. But even so, the usual strat here is to have like 10,000 guys in ships the size of YT freighters. Sometimes literally a YT freighter. They're flexible ships, they can be used as explorers. And those guys spent like 3 years cataloging 10 million planets, and at the end of it you found 1 or 2 good ones that'll make for sector capitals, and a few hundred other decent ones that a colony ship might settle for if they really want a planet for themselves, which a lot of people do. All this is to say that there is a huge amount of unexplored space between each planet I'm talking about today, so don't be surprised if it turns out there's like 12 sectors worth of cool stuff that we don't know about because the long-range explorers didn't happen to pick the right star systems on their way to the edge of the galaxy, and nobody's sunk in the resources needed for a complete survey of that part of space. That's why it's the unknown regions, even though we do know about a bunch of stuff out here. There's huge blank areas in between the points of light, and we have no idea what's in between. So, the Redoubt is a Chiss stronghold far removed from the rest of their space. The planets there are mostly garbage, but the Chiss built their civilization-scale panic room there because it's close enough to Chiss space to be plausibly reached by exiles or refugees, and the stars are packed tightly enough together to make hyperspace navigation slow and difficult, requiring several jumps, which means there's lots of defensible choke points. I think this is probably our clearest indication that Thrawn isn't giving us a comprehensive picture of Chiss society. He talks about Chiss society like it's 100% cunning aristocratic geniuses who value careful maneuvers and espionage the way he does. But then the one part of Chiss space that we can corroborate is a fortress. I suspect Thrawn, being our main source on Chiss society, is intentionally trying to keep its capabilities secret by focusing only on the ways it resembles himself, someone who we already know a lot about. Iokath and Zakul are described almost exclusively by pulp serials. During the Galactic Cold War between the Republic and the Sith Empire in the Old Republic era, a Sith Lord named Vidyate left the Empire and sought out an ancient superweapon, a vast armada from the unknown regions called the Eternal Fleet, operated by an army of droids. Vidyate used this to build the Eternal Empire, capitaled on Zakul, a planet whose native people had long been used as testing ground for Iokath's weapons before they were destroyed by a mysterious supership called the Gravestone. Eventually, the Eternal Empire returned to conquer the galaxy, and both the Republic and the Sith Empire were forced to unite to defeat it. Does this sound like a garbled retelling of the Jedi Civil War to anyone else? Old Republic era, a mysterious superweapon from the unknown regions gets discovered by a Sith Lord who uses it to conquer the galaxy. The only new touch is that this Sith Lord is a third faction to an existing frozen conflict between the Republic and another different Sith Empire. The Eternal Empire definitely has non-Sith vibes, but according to the legends, their ruler is still a Sith. How many ancient superfleets are we meant to believe are just lying around in the unknown regions? If we're to believe the whole Eternal Empire of Zakuul happened at all, I would strongly suspect that the origin of the Eternal Fleet is wrong. It's not an unrelated fleet that happens to be located in and function almost identically to the fleet Darth Revan created with the Starforge. It is the fleet Darth Revan created with the Starforge, or part of it at least. I totally believe that Revan created a backup fleet with the Starforge and hid it in the unknown region somewhere. That way, they would have a backup fleet if something ever happened to the Starforge. The Starforge's whole thing is its ability to produce stupendous amounts of war material by eating stars, and Revan wasn't on any kind of deadline to invade the Republic. There was no compelling reason not to create a backup fleet, especially since the Starforge itself was capable of maintaining itself across several millennia of inactivity. So it's entirely reasonable to think that the fleets it creates could last at least a few decades on autopilot under droid maintenance, which is all the time Revan would have needed it. After turning against the Sith Empire as a failed experiment, Revan famously left for the unknown regions. Possibly they were trying to recover the fleet but met with some fatal misadventure along the way. Or they might have decided this whole galactic conquest thing was just a bad idea and given up on it. In that case, the Eternal Empire might have found Revan's abandoned fleet over Zakuul and started using it for their own purposes. This would mean that a lot of the alleged details of the fleet's backstory are false, but it's not super well sourced anyway, and even if I'm speculating wildly, I find it much easier to believe that there was one Starforge that got used multiple times than that multiple different civilizations independently invented some kind of Starforge, and yet every single one of them collapsed, leaving behind only a few scant traces of their former empire. Ilum is a planet with deep ties to the Republic despite never having been in Republic space, because it was the primary source of Kyber crystals for the Jedi. Kyber crystals are an incredible power source. A lightsaber can last for centuries without being recharged or refueled in any way, and Kyber is the only power source compact enough to fuel the planet-destroying laser of the Death Star. Unfortunately for Ilum, but fortunately for the galaxy in general, you won't get a planet-destroying superweapon out of a Kyber crystal small enough to fit in a lightsaber hilt. The Empire strip-mined the planet for Kyber so aggressively that you can see the scars from orbit. Even the first Death Star was so Kyber-hungry that Sixth Black Sword made some expeditions to other planets in and around the unknown regions to get more, like Jeddah. And after 2 Death Stars, the only Kyber left in Ilum was in the planet's molten core. So, the First Order hooked the core up directly to a giant laser on one end, some engines on the other, and turned the whole planet into Starkiller Base. I guess they were hoping the third time would be the charm. The First Order did always have a problem with trying to recreate the Galactic Empire exactly, even though, the Empire lost the war. One of the other planets that Black Sword mined for Kyber was Jeddah, a moon orbiting the crystalline planet Na Jeddah. Na Jeddah is kind of like Ferrix. It's got a breathable atmosphere, you can live there, but there's no arable land, so you have to live on imports. Unlike Ferrix, no one ever dumps a bunch of valuable salvage there, so Jeddah is a moon, but it's the world people care about. It doesn't have as many Kyber crystals as Ilum, not nearly, but they're much more easily accessible, plus the Jedi kept the location of Ilum secret, while Jeddah was more known to the galaxy. During the High Republic era, tons of Force traditions gathered there to commune with the crystals, and the planet decided not to join the Republic in order to preserve its position as an independent meeting ground with no allegiance to any one way of thinking. This didn't stop the Odd War from breaking out for control of the planet's holy sites, but the Jedi were in a pretty good position to keep things tamped down. Their mastery of the Force was sufficient that they had the respect of other Force traditions, but their most sacred sites were all on planets like Tython, Ossus, and Coruscant. They weren't interested in controlling any specific sacred site on Jedi, only in being part of the Conclave of the Force, and their position on that Conclave was unimpeachable, so their only goal on Jeddah was to keep the peace. That doesn't mean they were shining superheroes who never did anything wrong. The Jedi habit of accepting some injustice in the name of preserving peace certainly scarred Jeddah once or twice, but they never wanted to conquer the planet outright, which made them a valuable counterbalance to some of the more aggressive Force traditions. The Force traditions on Jeddah were all pretty united in their dislike of the Empire on account of the Great Jedi Purge, but also really didn't want to draw the Empire's attention. This worked for them until Director Krennic got his hands on Project Stardust. It had been languishing after the sterilization of Geonosis, but he'd finally maneuvered himself into a position to get it done. Keenly aware that a lot of Imperials had built their careers around the Death Star being a boondoggle doomed to failure, and were desperate to make sure it failed, Krennic was racing to complete it before Palpatine pulled the plug. And while Ilum has an insane amount of Kyber, that's because the Kyber goes insanely deep, where it is also insanely difficult to mine. Krennic turned to other sites like Jeddah to get Kyber faster after the surface deposits on Island were exhausted. The local Force traditions hated the way their sacred sites were despoiled for industrial purposes, especially since they guessed, more or less correctly, that the Kyber was being used for some kind of enormous stockpile of weapons. Saw Gerrera's partisans had their origins on Onderon all the way over in the Inner Rim, but the large number of sympathizers on Jeddah led them to make their headquarters there, especially since they guessed, correctly again, that whatever the Empire was up to on Jeddah would be disastrous for the galaxy if it wasn't stopped. It's pretty well known how that turned out. The Death Star got all the Kyber it needed despite Saw Gerrera's best efforts. Test firing of the weapon obliterated Jeddah's capital city and ruined the planet's environment. The atmosphere was still breathable, and the ground was still intact, so the partisans kept using it as a base, but Saw Gerrera was dead, the Imperial operations on the planet were complete, and skirmishes with the garrison left behind were largely conducted out of spite and a lack of ideas for where to go next. That's where Leia Organa found them, soon after the Battle of Yavin, helped them take out some of the remaining Imperial operations that they'd been banging their head against, and convinced them to join the Rebel Alliance. The mining operations they targeted were desperately trying to pull any remaining Kyber out of the planet, which was always kind of stupid because the Death Star's attack was centered directly on the Kyber mines. That shit was gone. The first Death Star had gone the worst possible way for them, though. Alderaan's destruction enraged the galaxy, and a week later, the Death Star's destruction made the Empire look weak. The Empire was desperate to re-establish control over a rapidly disintegrating Outer Rim, and hoped they could still make the Tarkin Doctrine work if they built a second Death Star and didn't lose it this time. It's really emblematic of the lack of imagination Imperial leadership had at the time, even from Palpatine, who used to be a really cunning and adaptable man 20 years before that. Project Stardust having gone about as wrong as it possibly could have, lasting just long enough to unite rebel forces against the Empire, but destroying 0 rebel bases in the process. The Empire's response was to try and do Project Stardust again, and just kind of try not to fuck it up this time. They were so enamored with what the kind of control over the galaxy they thought the Death Star would give them, that they just refused to believe that it wouldn't work, even after seeing it literally explode in their face. Moving on, Parnassus was a mineral-rich planet on the fringe of the Republic's Spinwards territory in the late Republic era. It was colonized by the Constar Mining Corporation, but they abandoned it after their nuclear power network suffered some kind of critical system failure in the network itself, triggering meltdowns across the planet. Over a century later, the First Order rediscovered it while looking for places where they could recruit stormtroopers en masse without tipping off the New Republic to the scale of their operations. Parnassus used to have a pretty good climate, but the nuclear disaster reduced it to a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The carrying capacity wasn't very high, so the First Order didn't find the numbers they were looking for, but they did find Phasma, who later on went on to become the face, so to speak, of the First Order Stormtrooper Corps. General Hux, Admiral Hux's father, tried to play Phasma's Skyer clan and a rival Claw clan against each other to recruit the victors of the ensuing clan war as stormtroopers, presumably as a pilot program for similar operations across the planet. The First Order being what it is, it all immediately went to hell. The Skyer and Claw made an alliance of convenience against the First Order, despite their differences, and Hux's stormtrooper detail was killed to a man. Phasma really hated the Claw clan and threw in with Hux early on in hopes of eradicating them, and then doubled down when Skyer allied with the Claws against the First Order, so her bridges were completely burned. She knew the terrain well enough to help Hux escape until a First Order shuttle arrived to evacuate them. Phasma is the only stormtrooper recruit from all of Parnassus. She would later assassinate Hux with the help of his son. No one's been back to Parnassus since. As far as anyone knows, it's the same irradiated anarchy as it always was. Exegol is a planet in the unknown regions where an Imperial remnant led by unstable clones of Sheev Palpatine built a fleet to try and re-establish the Galactic Empire. It is a real place, but its depiction in what is technically a Papanoida film is not as reliable as that studio name suggests. See, Baron Papanoida sold his film studio a while after his Clone Wars movies, and the First Order films were made almost directly on top of the events they dramatize. Like, the events of the trilogy's last film hadn't even happened yet when the first film was being made. Papanoida films have a reputation for taking a faithfully, if selectively, depicted set of historical events and welding them together into a compelling story. The Galactic Civil War films take the Anakin is Vader theory as truth. Anakin is definitely the prime candidate for being Darth Vader, but we'll probably never know for sure. and told a story about how Anakin's children redeemed both their family lineage and Anakin himself over the course of the Galactic Civil War. The entire story of the Midrim Offensive got completely skipped over, unless you count the Battle of Hoth, but the middle of the film of the trilogy is called The Empire Strikes Back and effectively carries that on-the-run mood of the era while keeping the story laser-focused on Luke, Leia, and Vader. Contrariwise, the First Order films were made before all of the events had actually happened, so they had no chance of figuring out what their narrative was going to be until they were already 2 films in. Adding on to that, 2 different directors worked on the trilogy and they had directly opposed ideas for what the narrative of the trilogy should be. It's a confused mess made as events were unfolding, which means it put unconfirmed rumors into movies with the Papanoida Arts logo on them, but Baron Papanoida wasn't involved. Yes, Baron Papanoida had to commit to certain unproven theories in order to make his movies, most notably the Anakin is Vader theory, and the specific dialogue and choreography of his scenes are basically written from scratch. Rebel Pathfinders weren't Mandalorians or anything, but this specific shot was chosen because it was cinematic, not because Baron Papanoida was faithfully recreating the part of Han Solo's memoirs where he said, "Then me and my team stood directly in the line of fire while breaching the door of an enemy facility, ignoring nearby cover like idiots." But there is a massive gap between the creative liberties taken in the films made by Baron Papanoida himself and the films that came from his studio afterwards. The First Order movies did have a team of field researchers who went to active war zones to gather information for the films as best they could, and that does mean that these movies are probably closer to accurate than, say, the Dark Empire serial fiction that got posted to the HoloNet as events were unfolding, and later got packaged into a data cartridge for store shelves. But don't be confused into thinking that these films are as reliable as the ones made by Baron Papanoida personally. All this to say that, allegedly, Exegol was the site of Emperor Palpatine's cloning operation and, allegedly, was the site of a massive fleet-building enterprise that produced a fleet capable of conquering the galaxy from the resources of one planet, each ship of which was, allegedly, equipped with a Death Star super laser. And I don't believe it. And Dark Empire, another ripped from the headline serial that was written by some rando in the Inner Rim, scraping together a story from whatever rumors and reports were leaking out to the rest of the galaxy. The commonalities are a fleet built in secret by a clone of Emperor Palpatine trying to recreate the Sith Empire from a stronghold located on a single planet that isn't easily accessible to New Republic forces. And from that, there are 2 possibilities. Number 1. Palpatine found or created a Rakatan Starforge like the one Darth Revan used in the Jedi Civil War. Or number 2. This is all made up. The Imperial Remnant just gathered a bunch of Star Destroyers left over from the Empire in secret and waited for the New Republic to fully decommission the old Rebel fleet before making their move. Writers of historical fiction copied the entire fleet from nowhere aspect from Darth Revan with no basis in fact. I find the second one more likely. If there was a second Starforge, Revan probably would have found that one and used it too. And I doubt Palpatine was capable of building a Starforge in secret when he already torpedoed the economy making the Death Star, and his backup plan was another, slightly smaller Death Star. The cool thing about the Starforge is that after you use it to conquer the galaxy, you can use it to make consumer goods. You still have to eat stars, and that's got all kinds of gravitational knock-on effects for the environment, but if you're committed to doing it anyway to fuel your war machine, you can probably do it again to rebuild the galaxy afterwards. The Death Star can't do that. And Exegol does sound a lot like it was a core world from Sith space in the Old Republic era. It's a hidden world in an unknown region of space, just like Sith space used to be back in the early and Old Republic eras. It's a confluence of dark side energy that allegedly holds the secrets of immortality, similar to how Korriban and Dromund Kaas were described in the Old Republic era. It's a stronghold of ancient Sith industry, an entire planet turned into a factory for war machines, like Zeost crossed with the Starforge. And it's a convenient explanation for how the First Order got a fleet out of nowhere, even though it wasn't out of nowhere. Less than half of the Empire Star Destroyers are accounted for. There's no way all of those were maintained for 30 years. The economic impact would have been too easily visible, so some of them must have genuinely just rotted away. But it's not hard to believe that the Imperial Remnant might have had a fleet equivalent to Death Squadron squirreled away in a hidden stronghold somewhere. Now, Palpatine loved his weird non-Jedi Force traditions, especially the Sith. Darth Vader's castle on Mustafar is unmistakably using Sith architecture. And Palpatine used his power as ruler of the galaxy to create entire planets to suit his tastes in places like Biss. Exegol's coordinates are far from Sith space, but there's not any major power between them that would have been interested in stopping Sith colony ships, and ancient Sith warriors did have a habit of going on long journeys into distant space seeking the power of the dark side, some new weapon or technique that only they would have to give them an edge over their rivals on Korriban. And because Sith Lords love to have absolute power over other sentients, if they found a suitable planet, they would round up a colonial population and plant down an enclave where they could be Sith Emperor of a tiny one-planet empire far beyond the reach of the rest of the Sith. So it's not unreasonable that Exegol might be a real colony of the ancient Sith, which Palpatine rediscovered and took over or recolonized. So, does Exegol actually exist? Or is it just a hallucination of people jamming Darth Revan's superweapon as an explanation for any time an unexpected enemy fleet shows up from the unknown regions? Honestly, I'm not sure.